All right, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson and I'll be today's moderator. So I'd like to thank you for joining us for our SMA UK MOD panel discussion entitled Alternative Futures of Geopolitical Competition in a Post-COVID-19 World. And this is part 2 of a 2-part series. I'd like to thank today's panelists, Lieutenant Colonel Jake Sotiriadis, Ms. Vera Zakem, and Mr. Shannon McGurk for taking the time to present today. So before we begin, I have a few quick housekeeping items. So as usual, we will be having a Q&A session at the end of the talk. Feel free to just go to the icon, the little Q&A icon. It's 2 overlapping speech bubbles and 1 has a question mark. And make sure to type in your name and affiliation when you're asking a question, or if you'd prefer to remain anonymous, you can send your questions anonymously. Also be sure to like which questions you'd like to be addressed most by hitting the like button next to the person who asked the question's name. So now I'm going to briefly introduce each of today's speakers before we go ahead and begin. Dr. Jake Sotiriadis is the Air Force's Senior Futurist and Chief of Strategic Foresight. His work spans the nexus of disruptive technology, geopolitical risk analysis, and foresight analytics. He's also served as an advisor to the US Ambassador to Germany, as an intelligence briefer to the Secretary and Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and Deputy Chief of the Weapons and Space Division at the National Security Agency. We also have Ms. Vera Zakem, who is a Senior Technology and Policy Advisor with Technology for Global Security. She's also a recognized leader driving strategy at the intersection of global threats, policy, emerging technologies and innovation, and organizational strategy and operations. Vera is also a recognized expert on Russian influence and disinformation, the impact that technology plays in society and democracy, terrorism, and human security and stability. And last but not least, we have Mr. Shannon McGurk, who recently returned from Afghanistan and is currently working as a long-term analyst and futurist consultant for the U.S. Air Force Warfighting and Integration Capability, Strategic Foresight, and Futures Branch. He's also a retired Army Ground Cavalry China Foreign Area Officer and served on the Joint Staff, Army Staff as the Defense Intelligence Agency China Desk Officer and as an Assistant Army Attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. So I'm first going to turn the floor over to Lieutenant Colonel Sotiriadis to begin.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Good morning to you and good morning to everybody that's here on our panel session. Our team is very excited to be here for part 2. We were very, very pleased with the discussion that we were able to have and just for the opportunity to be able to share some of our analytic methodology and also some of the scenarios that we've developed to hopefully help try to make a bit of sense out of this present chaos and disruption that we're all living through in this COVID-19 world. So what I'm going to do is before I dive in, I'm just going to check to project my slides. And if you can just confirm, Nicole, that these are up so that everybody is able to see them. And 1 second. There we go. Okay, so they should be projecting now. Let me know if we are.
Yes, we currently see the grid.
Excellent. Okay. So what I'd like to do is, because we've got a few folks here on the panel today, we've got half of our team, the other half presented during the first presentation. I'm going to walk through a little bit of the methodology of how we designed the report, talk a bit about strategic foresight, and then actually delve into some of the specific subject matter areas. And then the best part, obviously, will be taking some questions and really getting into the nuts and bolts of strategic foresight and national security. So let me start actually by asking a question and arriving at how we got with building the report. So a few months ago, when we were all trying to sit back and understand some of the initial implications of the pandemic, we received a tasker, and that was develop some strategic lessons learned from COVID-19, and this was for the Air Force. Now, let me just caveat that by saying I'm not throwing the Air Force or any other institution under the bus here, because I think this is a question that probably most elements of the Department of Defense were grappling with. But I illustrate this point with a question because I'll say that the way we were asked to answer the question actually was the motivation for writing the report. We were asked to look at strategic implications and second and third order effects of COVID-19. But the quote that I have on the slide, and I'll read it for those of you who can't see the slide, observations should be a single statement of fact that is not too broad or sweeping or not too narrow. And so, we sat back and said, that's a very narrowly defined criterion to try to tackle as an issue as complex and multifaceted as strategic implications of COVID-19. So to really talk about how we answered the question, we actually said, well, we'll do you one better. We're going to harness a global network of strategic foresight and futures practitioners led by the Air Force. So the service here really taking the initiative, not only to drive the narrative, but to then to harness the external talent and partnerships to really foster the collaborative environment that we've created in our on the A5 staff and in our strategic foresight branch. And we created this Global Futures Report, which is just shy of about 50 pages, and we'll post the link after this. And I think Nicole and her team already sent out the link, but you'll be able to access this. It's an unclassified product. It's been downloaded, I think, thousands and thousands of times by now. But what we tried to do was, instead of arriving at definitive conclusions, actually use this document as a means to disrupt the way we conceptualize the very concept of national security itself. And so when we ask, are we even asking the right questions? This was our attempt to sort of frame the strategic environment for the senior leadership of the Department of the Air Force and the Department of Defense, but also get into some of the nuts and bolts by identifying sources of disruption. So let's get a bit into what strategic foresight and future studies is, because I'll tell you right now, there's a lot of bad information and a lot of negative connotations when we talk about futures. And that really has to do with the fact that there are so many folks out there as self-professed futurists who haven't really been trained in any of these very exquisite analytic methodologies. So in a nutshell, strategic foresight is really anticipatory thinking to support decision-making and ultimately make better decisions. Part of that is premised on understanding and anticipating change in society, but also understanding the historical sources of change. And sometimes I like to say that historians are ironically the best futurists because they understand some of the historical trajectories and they can understand how to frame issues. But how does this apply to something like diplomacy or military strategy or intelligence? Well, I'd argue that we actually need to democratize futures thinking and strategic foresight, in particular in the realm of national security, because we fundamentally trade in the currency of uncertainty. And the premise of future studies writ large is not that we're going to predict the future. That's certainly not the core task of what we're trying to do. It's rather an acknowledgement that the future as a singular entity does not exist. There are many possible futures, and those futures are constantly in flux. And so we need to actually ask ourselves, how can alternative futures, which is what we are building out, defy these accepted probabilities and actually stretch, challenge, and create different assumptions than we currently have? So I'll frame a bit how the private sector uses strategic foresight and then weave back into how in the national security realm this is directly applicable. The lexicon of futures and foresight really focuses on things like identifying weak signals, emerging trends, and then mapping out the trajectory of change and building out scenarios so that we can actually get to preferred futures or aspirational futures, developing scenarios that allow us to achieve those positive and favorable outcomes. So, for example, in industry, probably the most notable example was the Royal Dutch Shell Company back in the late 60s, early 70s, that was very successful in building out scenarios that allowed the company to weather the oil crises of that time period. And if you look at the two questions I posed, I'll just read one for those who can't see the slides. How could UPS leverage blockchains now to gain a competitive advantage over Amazon over the next 5-year period, right? So that's something that industry might use it for. But when we talk about national security, when the costs of error are so high, this is a different element and a different criticality than the private sector has. And where the private sector companies in general have flatter organizations in some cases, we know that in the national security realm, we're often put into hierarchical organizations that are mired in bureaucracy. And so we've got to ask ourselves, if it's difficult for cutting edge companies in industry to do this, how much more difficult is it to implement this kind of methodology and thinking in the national security enterprise? The other part of that is that when we talk about a 20 or 30-year look, or even a 15-year look into the future, The environment in which we live tends to be characterized by short-term budget cycles. And so those who can claim small victories, or even large victories, I guess I would add, are those that are able to sort of win those short-term budget gains. And many times we do that at the expense of, I think, longer-term strategic planning that then we have to go back and correct. But at that point, it's too late. I put this slide up here, and for those of you who can't see, this is just highlighting the recent varsity blues scandal that took place when we had many affluent parents paying elite universities to build fake profiles for their children to get accepted. I put this in there because, again, the national security establishment is a microcosm of our society writ large. The core issue here, and you might be asking yourself, why is he even bringing this up? The core issue behind this scandal really has to do with the fact that we are obsessed with exclusivity in higher education. And this becomes problematic in the sense that we have institutions of higher learning that are premising their reputations based on the amount of students that they reject, not necessarily how many they're able to educate and send off into the workforce. And I would argue that if you listen to Arizona State University President Michael Crow, who's a brilliant educator and a visionary thinker in American education, he talks about inclusivity equaling excellence and access together. And he's implementing some very radical and very impressive programs at his university. I'd extrapolate that and make the same argument in the realm of national security and futures thinking. We cannot afford to have pockets of excellence in certain offices in the Pentagon that are the sole ones responsible for futures and foresight. Rather, we need to build an inclusive culture of national security futurists premised on this excellence and access, so that we can actually create a culture that functions much like an operating system 24/7 in the background versus a smartphone app that we can just press a button and get an answer. But this requires significant education in people and also tools, but we also have to understand that this is a cultural shift. This is what I'm calling democratizing futures thinking. And to do this, and when we highlight how we had written the report, we really were able to do these three things, and we're continuing to implement this on the air staff in the A57. Number one, recognizing that we have to take a systems-based approach, that everything is interconnected. Issues that seem unitary or singular, I would argue, are probably not. And there are touch points in the frameworks that we look at when we talk about something like the STEEP framework, scientific, technological, economic, environmental, and political issues. We have to recognize that touch points across the realm of those issues come back and touch something like the Air Force's core mission. We cannot be myopic in our view of how we're going to attack a particular issue. We got to recognize that things are interconnected. Number two, this premise that everyone is a futurist. And so we all have an image of what the future could be, but not everybody has had the benefit of a futurist education. And this is where our leaders need to come in and empower people to develop what I'm calling this cognitive operating system to really affect this seismic shift that we need to have in the way we think. And number three, we've got to embrace analytic complexity in our thought processes. When I say complexity, what I'm really referring to is an acknowledgement that we can't have linear thinking of point A to point B to really get into the crux of these difficult and challenging issues. We have to understand that we trade in the currency of codependent variables, recognizing there's multi-source causality behind a particular issue. I think this is really, if we're able to implement these three items, we'll be well on our way, and we are continuing to do so on the air staff today. Now, there was a recognition, and I think there is, when we talk about things like joint all-domain command and control, that the U.S. military has the digital connection deficit. We recognize that the connectivity that we have today in our homes, using things like Alexa, using multiple wireless devices that operate off of a single wireless network, that's something that we've come to expect as the norm of 21st century life. We recognize that there are deficits in that digital connectivity within the military, and of course the services and the joint staff and everyone is working to remedy that. But what about our cognitive connective deficits? How are we fixing those types of issues, which frankly may turn out to be even more consequential, as this really is the way that we conceive of the strategic environment in which we operate? So for strategic foresight, I'll get into how this is different. This is not necessarily how we've traditionally understood trend analysis or intelligence analysis. So for example, trend analysis in general terms gives us an image of what to expect if the present continues. If our projections that we've made, all things being equal, continue, that gives us a trend analysis. Intelligence assessments, and being an intelligence officer myself, understand how these things are built, understand how we consume and produce information, and then communicate that information. Typically, these are likely adversary courses of action or least likely adversary courses of action that we build based on established patterns of behavior or pattern of life. Strategic foresight actually forces us to take a step further and expand our intellectual horizons in a different way by examining the totality of weak signals and emerging trends that we see today, mapping out the sources of disruption, and then actually building out scenarios, turning up the volume on those weak signals to develop plausible scenarios that allow us to future-proof our strategic plans and then also challenge our assumptions. And I point this graphic here for a reason, just to showcase the fact that over the last several years, we've been talking increasingly about great power competition, and rightly so. That's certainly the challenge of our time. But if we look at the sources of violent conflict, the sources of warfare across the globe, and this data is from 2017 until now, and you can check this at the Institute for Conflict Research in Heidelberg, Germany. The item that's circled there is ideology. Step back and think about that for a minute. If ideology is the main source of violent conflict over the last 3-4 years, what kinds of studies, what kinds of modeling are we doing to really get into the emerging ideological models of these competitor states in our great power competition? We'll come back to that. So as we put our Global Futures Report together, mapping out the sources of disruption, we identified these key areas that you can see. Competition in space, autonomous systems, supply chains and national security, malign influence campaigns, and then geopolitical areas like the Belt and Road Initiative in China, the future of competition in the Middle East, new fault lines there, and also the future of transatlantic relations. We used each individual section that was written as what we call horizon scanning. And horizon scanning really means just that, looking for these weak signals and emerging trends that are in the strategic environment today, and then building out a section of this document, which we then overlaid together, and then we're able to create 4 global scenarios. They gave us a picture of what we could expect on a global scale in 2035, again, turning up the weak signals. So the process for building this, when we explore the second and third order effects of the pandemic, is what you see here, which is essentially identifying the historical sources of disruption or change. What were those key contributing factors? How did those issues materialize? And then overlaying that with today. Are we seeing instances where those emerging historical sources of disruption are materializing now? What are the touch points now to our strategic planning? And where are these weak signals coming from? After that, we're able to overlay this information into some very exquisite data visualization and then ask the question, okay, if we build out 4 scenarios, we'll get into that in just a minute. In each one of these scenarios, there are winners and there are losers. When we give this information to our senior leaders, what we're actually giving them is a means with which to project in every scenario, if these are the winners and losers, how do we need to change our thinking or our strategic planning to ensure that the United States, writ large, or the Department of Defense, Department of the Air Force, respectively, are on the winning side. And we do that by actually building out aspirational futures, asking questions that seem quite intuitive, things like, what are our preferred futures? What does our organization want? But in many cases, as we've done these exercises and projects, we see that that sometimes just isn't the case. When I talk about these scenarios, I want to just give you a brief overview of what they are and why we selected them. Now, we use scenarios that are built out of what's called the 4 Futures Framework, and this was developed by Dr. Jim Dater, who's really considered the father of future studies, and he used to be the director of the Research Center for Future Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, which is a global powerhouse of strategic foresight and futures. And these are pretty much archetypical scenarios of outcomes that have occurred throughout history. So when we talk about a growth scenario, a continued growth future essentially gives us an image of how different things could be if fundamental principles do not change, okay? So we ask for example, what would be the consequences of a 20-year almost Cold War? What if we never entered this Thucydides trap with China, right? So again, this future is really meant to show us the costs of inaction rather than surprise us with the unexpected. When we move to a disciplined futures really show us that collapses are not always complete or transformational. What do I mean by that? This means that think about the period during the Great Depression through the Second World War, where we had regulating of prices, we had rationing of food, we had even regulating of freedom of movement at times. All of these things managed nationally because the market economy failed to accomplish these tasks. This is an important means to look at how we actually try to mitigate a systemic collapse and what that kind of a future would look like. Now we get into more of the fun ones that I think most futurists would say that they like building, which is the systemic transformation, which is a fundamental shift in the rules of an established order. And many people are talking about transformational scenarios today. But we should keep in mind that transformations are also subjective outcomes, right? So if we look at the French Revolution, which was certainly a transformation future, depending on whether or not you were storming the Bastille or you defending it, you might think about that issue differently. So we have to recognize that things like populism, democracy, market economies have intensified freedom just as much as they've intensified violent conflict and the destructive character of war. And finally, sort of that doomsday collapse scenario, systemic collapse gives us the possibility of a sudden loss of order. So this really provokes us to consider how we would adapt to a radical change in our expectations or a significant shift in the rules of change. So an example of this could be the end of the Cold War or the collapse of the European colonial system after World War II. Again, highlighting that actors must rapidly make new rules and find new alliances. And I've heard lots of discussion about potential collapse scenarios. And to be honest, as we published this report in June, some of the elements that we talk about in the collapse scenario actually don't seem as far-fetched as when we had written them a few months ago. So we put this next graphic here to just show you this is the value proposition that strategic foresight and futures can give when we're trying to look at something and frame the issue in terms of where do we go next from here. And so I would argue that a few months ago, we certainly were at that center point in this graphic, which is the circle asking us, where do we go from here? Is this a sudden disruptive shift? Is it going to be a continuation of things after this? Or are we looking at a rapid growth scenario or rapid decay? The ability to frame this issue, right? And I put this graphic here just to illustrate that most of the discussion that was occurring a few months ago, at least in our realm, had to do with which programs do we need to cut? What's going to happen to our budgets? Where do we need to divest? Or maybe where do we need to reinvest? And what we argued actually was, before we even have that discussion, let's take stock of what's happening in the strategic environment. Let's frame in this comprehensive manner, I think, some of the initial ramifications, but then sort of game out in these alternative future scenarios, some plausible futures, and then ask ourselves, what do we need to do to future-proof our planning to enable us to weather any one of these outcomes? So I'm going to quickly step through each of these future scenarios, and the ones that I'm talking about now are the global scenarios. So these are the totality of each section of the report, putting all that horizon scanning together, and then extrapolating these global scenarios out of them. So for Global Future 1, this is the systemic transformation, a fundamental shift in the rules of an established order. So what we're looking at now in 2035 as defining the great powers as those states that have achieved superior levels of bioresiliency vis-a-vis their peer competitors. So what we're talking about now is national security being as much about national biodata stockpiles and also coupling that with networking our military forces. So it's really about which powers are able to combine bioresiliency along with this ability to make information ubiquitous at a scale and scope necessary to network their armed forces. These are the states that dominate that new competition. Additionally, we see things like real-time contact tracing, genetic profile building, and then pattern of life analysis for contagion and AI-enabled heuristics really ushering in this new reality behind this transformation scenario. When we talk about number 2, global future 2 is our systemic collapse. This is the new warring states period, and that's what we're titling this scenario. And again, this is the sudden loss of an established order. And so when we talk about some of the weak signals and emerging trends, and my colleague, Mr. McGurk, is going to talk about that today when he discusses China, we look at the 2030s really being this period of global conflict, and the most prominent of which is the second civil war that happens in China in less than 100 years, which is the 21st century's first continental scale civil war. But the bigger issue here, I think, on a global scale in this scenario is that this idea that governments no longer, in general, have the trust of their populace, and that there is a significant legitimacy crisis in the ability of governments to provide for safety and security of their citizens. And so you have this second crisis that emerges, the second legitimacy crisis, which really focuses on this idea of the truth narrative itself. And that's actually the bigger victim in this systemic collapse period. In Global Future 3, we talk about authoritarian regionalism. And this is the discipline scenario, right? So showing us that a collapse is not necessarily always complete. And in this scenario, we're actually looking at authoritarian regimes and liberal democratic regimes really resorting to some of the same tactics to keep order in their societies. So we're talking about highly centralized and restrictive measures with mandatory surveillance regimes. We're talking about things like even access to basic necessities, as we see bouts of COVID-19 recur over these next 10 to 15 years, real-time biosurveillance and unannounced health checks. But again, winners and losers in each scenario. We're now seeing national militaries starting to augment commercial supply chains. And so when we talk about oversight and production of goods, preventing riots and hoarding, there's a different reliance on the armed forces, and in particular on the Air Force, in terms of how it's going to augment supply chains and deliver goods and services. Now, Global Future 4 centers on the continued growth scenario. And again, continued growth shows us exactly what a scenario would look like if things, or how different things could be if fundamental principles don't change. So what we're seeing here in this continued growth scenario, we're calling it endemic disruption. Now that states understand windows of opportunity when they can map out the data profiles of their populations and their adversary, their competitors' populations, we're seeing that becoming an impetus for aggressive actions in the policy realm. And so we're calling this a rhythmic readiness. This instability now enables territorial incursions. States understand that they've got this locked-in window to basically do what they want, to maybe do territorial grabs, to perhaps have a more aggressive foreign policy, to be able to really take actions that their competitors would not be able to effectively respond to, based on the fact that they're tied down dealing with further bouts of COVID-19 and other strains. But again, winners and losers in each of these scenarios. In this case, the U.S. Air Force significantly benefits because there's a necessity here to implement a new offset strategy that limits the reliance on overseas troop levels. So here we're seeing things like less civilian air traffic and a much higher reliance on unmanned aerial vehicles, and then also long-term low-orbit surveillance systems. So a few key points on the global scenarios. Again, the point of this report is not necessarily to take the scenarios literally, but what the scenarios represent is really turning up the volume significantly on the weak signals and emerging trends that we've identified within each section of the report. And I would encourage you to, if you have some time, to take a minute and read through the scenarios. They're very well developed, and there's certainly more data than I'm able to cover in this presentation today. But if I could just leave you with a few key points on the global scenarios writ large. Really, it's this, and you're going to hear later today on malign influence campaigns in China, but this idea that now when we talk about competition and disinformation, it's not necessarily going to be limited to a singular actor. And Vera is going to talk to you about that today. We really have to prepare for a congruence of these actors, for a simultaneous influence campaign that's going to be waged really at a global scale on global populations. Additionally, and I'll talk about this in a minute, we've got these new emerging fault lines in the Middle East, also and in the Eastern Mediterranean, that are really challenging, I think, some of our assumptions based on our security alliances and partnerships. And then what you'll hear Shannon McGurk talk about later is that this pandemic really is accelerating the export of China's worst characteristics and actually delaying the Belt and Road Initiative. On the flip side, in the US homeland, we've recognized that just like after the 9/11 attacks, we saw an increased acquiescence and acceptance of security regimes at airports, right? We certainly haven't flown the same way since then. And so we see this perhaps as a window of opportunity to accept more surveillance and automation in the name of public health moving forward. And so I'll leave you with those thoughts. What I will briefly step through as well before we get into the other two sections is today we want to talk about transatlantic relations and the future of that issue, malign influence campaigns, and then the future of China's Belt and Road. And so when we talk about the section on post-COVID futures for Europe, what we're really seeing is that COVID-19 is exacerbating the fissures that were already existing in the European Union when we talk about its ability to maintain both political and economic solidarity. So we ask these questions, what does a post-pandemic order look like for Europe? What are the pressure points that we're seeing today? Which weak signals and emerging trends can we extrapolate? And then if we build some scenarios, how might those impact the future of transatlantic relations? And so we've identified these key sources of disruption. And I think most of these are probably in line with what many of us are thinking. But recently, what we're seeing is certainly a lot of security disruption in the Eastern Mediterranean that I'll talk about. And this is certainly something that I think has been a long time coming, and that there have been weak signals and emerging trends to that effect for a while, but not sure to the extent to which we've been paying attention and dedicating resources. So when we look at all of these sources of disruption, how do we then forge forward in different scenarios for Europe? So in our European future, the first one, again, this is going to be our continued growth scenario. We're talking about a European disunion 2.0. And we're talking about really the summer tourist season, which just passed, leading to this resurgence of COVID-19, really hitting the Southern European countries hard that already came out of this terrible economic crisis. But also now this increase in malign influence in the Balkans by Russia, which really is challenging regional integration efforts to bring all the Balkan countries together and to really under the European umbrella, and also to challenge Russian malign influence there. And also we're seeing new waves of refugees from North Africa in this scenario really exacerbate the EU's fragile migration efforts, as well as more waves of refugees that are exiting Syria and other areas through Turkey into Europe. In our second future here, this is the discipline scenario. We've called this the austerity redux and supranational medicine. And so now we see this failure to adopt best practices to combat COVID-19, really seeing the contagion spread throughout EU member states, even the ones that were actually successful in initially stemming the flow in the early 2020s. So now we're seeing a more federalized union in Europe, and even more authority being ceded to Brussels after this 2028 Berlin Protocol that we talk about. So now we're talking about, again, this biosecurity network being mandated by the Commission, and we don't want to have, and countries certainly run the risk of an increased security threat if they decide to split from this biodata network. In our collapse scenario, again, sort of the more dystopian look of what happens with a sudden loss of order. This we call the revenge of the nation state. And so we're looking at recurring waves of COVID-19 coupled with a global depression, really just hampering the European Union's ability to deal with all of these crises. Looking at perhaps a different policy direction from Washington after the elections, looking at things like Russian-speaking expatriates suddenly arriving in the Baltics that creates a precursor for military incursions. And then also we see this really heightened activity in the Eastern Mediterranean, which just never gets resolved in the early 2020s. And then you couple that with increased jihadist attacks in Spain from North Africa, and we see this systemic collapse that the European Union just doesn't have the political and economic unity to hold itself together. Then there's the transformational scenario, which is what we're calling Washington, Berlin, and Ankara. This is the transformation, which is the possibility of not only a transformation of the system itself, but also a shift in the rules of an established order. So now we see actually the opposite effect, where the wave of COVID-19 that returns actually is an opportunity for increased collaboration and really sort of this golden era of transatlantic relations. We see that the Europeans actually discover that there's a massive Chinese surveillance scheme within their 5G telecom networks, and so their ability or their willingness to continue collaborating with China is certainly not the same. But this hard Brexit that occurs in the early 20s really reduces Britain's influence on a global level, and we see the United States now establishing a special relationship with Germany, where Germany now becomes the most important economic and security partner in Europe. And then also in this future, we see the fact that the AKP in Turkey is defeated in the early 20s and accompanied by massive Western investments in Turkey to the point where we have a secular renewal, and actually Turkey is admitted to the European Union in the early 2030s. So again, lots to talk about here in these scenarios, but we have to also briefly talk about what's happening today and some of these weak signals to this effect with these new fault lines that are being drawn in the Eastern Mediterranean. And when I talked a bit before about ideological futures and why it's so important to look at that, most of the literature that you're going to read, especially in the Western media, is really highlighting the current crisis between two NATO members, Greece and Turkey, in the Eastern Mediterranean. And they're really framing it in terms of energy disputes, right? Historical rivalries and energy disputes. The problem with that is they're completely ignoring that this problem actually is a fundamentally ideological problem as much as it is an energy problem. And what's happening in terms of this aggressive foreign policy that we're seeing by Turkey is underwritten by this pan-Islamist and neo-Ottoman ideological model that's manifesting itself across a whole host of areas, not only in the Aegean. And we're seeing Turkey actually playing this role of exporting political Islam, where you have President Erdogan opening mosques in places like Somalia, taking trips even to Indonesia to promote this, and sort of really becoming this champion of a pan-Islamic brand. What that's actually doing, though, is pushing countries like Egypt, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain together, actually converging on their interests with Israel. Obviously, yesterday, we had the big announcement and the signing ceremony of the Abraham Accords. But also now you're seeing countries like France exposing fissures within the European Union, where France is willing to take a more hardline approach and actually exercise, I think, security policy, exercising militarily with Greece, the UAE, and other countries in the area actually standing up to this aggression. And so when we look at this map, we talk about this. The reason I bring this to your attention is because these fault lines today have major implications, not only for the region, but for the very future and integrity of the NATO alliance itself. And certainly the conflict in Libya that continues to rage, that front that was open after the NATO alliance had overthrown Gaddafi, has left this gap now where we actually have a proxy war that's being fought now between Turkey and between Russia over the dominant, which side will dominate that competition in Libya. And the last slide I'll leave us with here before we step into the other sections is that this map here that looks at the different exclusive economic zones and continental shelf disputes is important because we talk about direct NATO and American interests that are being impacted here. When we talk about things like delineating exclusive economic zones now, where we have Egypt and Greece having concluded an agreement to establish a maritime border between those countries, which nullified Turkey's attempt to do the same thing with Libya back in January of this year. And of course, we still have the unresolved Cyprus problem. And now with the discovery of gas deposits in the Eastern Mediterranean, we're seeing that the Eastern Mediterranean today is looking increasingly more like the South China Sea than any other region. And so we have this whole confluence of actors, geopolitical interests, and many, many weak signals, and frankly, even strong signals coming out of this region that I think we need to really pay a lot more attention to than we have in the past. And so obviously this issue will remain open and ongoing, but we'll continue to look at the implications there as it plugs into strategic foresight writ large. So I've given you a lot to think about there, and I want to turn it over now to Vera Zakem, who is going to talk to you about malign influence campaigns. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen here in just a second, and we will go back to Vera's section. Thank you all for your attention, and we look forward to taking your questions as we move on from this. So go ahead, Vera.
Okay, well, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Well, again, thanks, Jake, for such a lovely introduction and for giving such a fantastic overview of the futures, the Air Force Futures Report. And, myself also as a futurist, a longtime futurist, if you will, and thinking about how the importance really of scenarios. Ultimately, I'm a futurist and a strategist in the sense that I think thinking about the future as well as the past is really, really important is in strategic planning and operational planning as well, and decision making. So I think when we think about this kind of geopolitical trends and positioning ourselves to 2035, this becomes really, really important. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about today with you all is the extent of both malign influence and disinformation campaigns, kind of giving the baseline of where things are right now, if you will, and then thinking about not necessarily full-blown scenarios, but what the future may even look like in the next 10, 20 years, and what should we be doing and actually preparing ourselves for it. So a couple of things first. I want to just kind of to level set. I think there is a long debate, and there's all these different terms that are being flown around. What is malign influence, disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy theories? So just a couple of things to level set off the start when I say, and I make that distinction between disinformation and malign influence campaigns. So first, disinformation is the is by an actor an intentional spread of either false information. I like to say there could be a grain of truth in a sea of lies. It doesn't have to be all false. It can have an aspect of it, but there's usually malicious intent to spread some sort of lie, some sort of a conspiracy theory, some sort of information. But there's also that malicious intent with the actual objective in mind to have some sort of a disruption. I talk about disinformation campaigns. I say there are campaigns. They're just not, you need to think about them holistically, not just a specific small act. It can happen by both state and non-state actors. We can talk about ISIS, we can talk about Boko Haram, we can talk about, of course, Russia and China and Iran, but again, state and non-state actors. Misinformation is usually referring to it doesn't necessarily have to have that malicious intent. It can be pretty benign. It can, we as everyday citizens, well-informed and educated population can also spread misinformation and be victims of it. So, you see something on social media, perhaps it is a title, a sensationalized title or a post, and it basically, it kind of captures your eye and you're like, oh, this looks interesting and this seems credible from a credible source, because maybe you see one source and you choose to reshare it or retweet it. So misinformation may have a malicious intent, but often it does not, and it can be pretty innocuous and harmless. And then like just level set, so malign influence campaigns. When I think about malign influence campaigns, it's not just disinformation, but it is a broad system of intentional influence by an actor, often state actor or non-state, and I say often state because I'll tell you why in a second, to achieve their desired objectives in line with their broader strategy and national security, foreign policy, economic policy, or domestic policy. And often there's 4 different types of levers. There's certainly media, right? So disinformation and misinformation and the spread of conspiracy theories, whether it's on social media or mainstream media, or even through friends and family, that's one lever. The other is society and culture. So think about camps, clubs, church, or so religious institutions, all of that. Then there's, without a question, there's business and business interests, so trade, investments, corrupt ownership of certain institutions, of media institutions, back tied to the media. So probably I would say the business side is almost arguably one of the biggest levers here supporting all of this disinformation discussion. And then the other one, which we see it probably almost anywhere in the world, really is the lever of political influence. So when you have potentially a malicious actor, state or non-state, actually making ties or choosing to make ties with a certain political entity in order to achieve their desired objectives. So I put that in context because I think there's oftentimes you have this situation where people say disinformation, blind influence campaigns, especially, and they're talking about the same thing, but they're actually not. So what is it about, like, so to think about, again, thinking about the future to level set, like how would an adversary think and how would an adversary design a disinformation campaign? Well, first and foremost, it really is about, you know, just like us on our side, meaning on US and allies, you know, the adversary might actually assess and strategize what that disinformation or malign influence campaign might look like. And, you know, that can be figuring out, okay, well, who are their targeted population that they're talking about? What are the vulnerabilities and, if you will, structural societal issues? And how should they actually form a strategy to exploit? And then it's all about creating specific targeted narratives for the targeted audience, as well as personas. So it's really, the narratives have to be, and the counter narratives in that fact have to be targeted to, whether it's to specific segments of the population, to specific local institutions. And then if they're using social media, it is about creating personas. Not all social media platforms are different, but creating different types of personas, and if applicable, also creating bots. And then the other piece about it, as part of their strategy on the adversary side, is the ability to both push and amplify. So we've seen this by Russia in 2016. We've continued to see this in 2020. We see this in other parts of the world where, if, for example, Internet Research Agency, IRA, they're creating content, right, originating not in sort of the targeted country, but creating content and pushing that content. But what we're now seeing in the direction where this is going, it's not only just happening in the United States, but in different parts of the world we can see, is the amplification. And the amplification where it may happen in a different country, or it may happen in, you know, in the country, the intended targeted country. So case in point, there's a lot of disinformation, significant disinformation that's been happening around COVID, right? And what a lot of experts have dubbed as the infodemic, right? And so what's easy now by, for example, Russia and China, is the ability not just to create disinformation and create fake content on social media, but they're able to literally do a lot less and achieve a lot more by amplifying that content, because that content is not only generating in other countries, but it's actually generating here in America by Americans. So that's what I'm talking about. Amplification doesn't have to just originate over, it doesn't need to originate in some place, but it can be amplified by the actual local population. And then the final piece, in the way adversary thinks about it, and certainly how we tend to also think about it, which I think is really, really mission critical to thinking about the futures, is to be able to measure the impact. So did that influence campaign work? Did that disinformation campaign work? Did we achieve the desired objective that we sought out to achieve? So if it works, you do more of it. If it doesn't work, you maybe shift gears or dial something down. I know with Russia, with Kremlin, they do a lot of it. It's not a consistent strategy that works across the board for any different operating environment, but it really can shift and change. And so again, works, dial up, doesn't work, dial down. So just to give you a couple examples, and here I just have like a few examples just to kind of, again, level setting here on Russia and China. I mean, certainly we've seen both countries using state media to push out disinformation. They're both creating content and amplification. They're creating fake personas. But what you're also seeing with China, obviously, you see this actually in Russia, but I think China is even more so, is this media censorship and monopoly also for media as well. You know, with culture and society, on Russia's side, you have everything from Ruski Mir and Orthodox Church, Confucian Institutes on the China side, certainly political relationships, as I talked about, and a ton of business and private sector kind of influence, if you will, particularly around corruption. I think we've seen this with Russia, and certainly we see this in China, in regarding to trade, and also a lot of tech and innovation is coming from China, but not all of it is good. Some of it is indeed truly malign. So with that, again, just kind of level setting, let me kind of talk to you a little bit about like the four futures as I see them, if you will. And again, they're not all full-blown scenarios, but keeping in mind or keeping in construct with the 2035 sort of outlook, if you will, and what Jake has presented. I just kind of want to give you sort of the four futures. So the one is really talking about the what I would call the apathetic and helpless population. So when we think about the apathetic and helpless population, I'm talking about what this results to is impaired population that can easily be influenced by any actor, and anyone can be easily divided. You either can have a situation that is almost hyper aware of everything that's going on, feeding off of sensationalized information, or you have a situation because all of this disinformation, all of this information flooding is coming to you, you're feeling extremely helpless and apathetic to a point where you're just so accustomed and used to this information where you're just okay, well, this is happening, and almost like a so what kind of a situation. And again, it can be experienced within the population. If you think about it, how does this happen? Yes, micro-targeting on social media specifically is one of it, but also particularly when feeling of this kind of like both helplessness and the hyper awareness, because we're constantly in this information overload. And I think positive going into the future, this is something that we're going to continue to see, is this information overload. It's coming from social media, it's coming from friends and family, it's coming from mainstream media. And when it's everything combined, you often are in a place, if you will, like psychologically, where you just don't know where to turn and don't know who to trust and how to trust that information that you're actually consuming. And think about sort of the constant, whether it's coming from social or mainstream, you're on your iPhone and constant notifications, right? But especially think about like what we're living now during COVID. Is there a vaccine? Is there no vaccine? Is it Russia? Is it China? Is it someone else? What's the president doing? I mean, and again, multiply that 10x that by multiplying that in a global and regional context. So that's why I say, it is very much of this kind of in the future when we're thinking about this, very much of this apathetic and helpless population that we're going to see when we're thinking about the future and addressing any one of these kind of challenges and conflicts, even the ones that Jake described in other scenarios that we describe in the report. So the other one I think it's very important to talk about is what might a vaccine and what I would call like infodemic 2.0 look like, right? We're already seeing this in COVID, and COVID just unleashed a whole lot of ugly on this. But what we're seeing now and what we are likely going to see in the future is this congruence of actors waging both disinformation and malign influence campaigns. Some of those partnerships can be direct, and some of those partnerships can be indirect, meaning someone from the Russian government posts a tweet and someone else, like a lone wolf, or whether it's just a domestic actor, it can be extremist, it can be, or not, just the individual, just retweeting that post, and then having also, when you're thinking about that, both direct and indirect relationships. And who are those actors? It's everyone from the usual suspects, meaning Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, but also regional and local actors and the subnational actors. But also, it's very, very important to think about the fringe movements. We're certainly seeing you don't have to go very far then in America today to see the fringe movements that are happening here in our society. All the conversations around Antifa and Kenon, and then also, like I mentioned, I cannot underestimate the importance of friends and family on all of this. And where in friends and family are also can be, when I talked about both dis and misinformation, actually, they can intentionally spread it, or it can be very, very harmless. But the idea here, this is your nucleus, if you will. This is the place where you go to trust for, if you will, for your trusted sources of information. And they, if you will, friends and family are often the ones that you go to first for any kind of information, whether it's on online or offline. And why it's really, and then I should also say one other point. And the other one, when you with social media especially, and we see this a lot with Facebook, there have, for example, the Facebook groups. There are a lot of malicious actors in those groups. So when we think about vaccines, I'm going to call them the moms and parent groups, where there's been a lot of anti-vax communities that have been, based on sort of people's beliefs that they've been established, and they're going kind of against science and against evidence. So what would look like in the future if we were to have another pandemic? I mean, we're still reeling with COVID. We're still figuring out whether we're going to have a vaccine. What kind of vaccine is it going to have? Is it going to go through trial? Is it going to be scientific and evidence-based? All these questions are still the unknowns for the next year. So imagine if there's another pandemic and we have to do this another time all over again. So we're going to have another situation. Let's say we recover from this. I'm just giving the best case scenario. Maybe we'll recover somewhat, right? There's low trust again in public institutions. We're again going to see influence campaigns on all channels about a potential virus and vaccines. And we're going to have high skepticism and the reliability and effectiveness of the vaccine. There's just going to be high skepticism if this is actually going to work for any kind of a pandemic. And then the other thing, I'm going to talk a little bit about technology. I mean, now also not just from the government and policy community, but also from tech. We're definitely going to see, and we're already seeing this in COVID, but I think this is something that we're going to see in the future, is the competition for any kind of vaccine for any kind of virus or pandemic, because at the end of the day, everyone is in it for themselves. And particularly what we see with COVID, this is a global pandemic. Everyone is trying to get their hands on the best stuff. So that's that. And I just had like two more things to go through for you. The other thing is I wanted to talk about what I'm calling in the future the altered information funnel. And what I imagine or envision or kind of think about in the post-COVID future, we are likely going to see a much greater competition for influence. But again, it's just, I want to point out this is, and I touched on this already, it's not just going to come from media. It's not just going to come from social media, where I know a lot of these days when we talk about disinformation and misinformation, we're focusing on all different social medias. By the way, let's not only talk about Twitter, Facebook, let's talk about Pinterest, let's talk about Nextdoor, let's talk about all the other, TikTok, of course, all the other platforms. But we're talking about societal influence, right? Again, going back to friends and family. But what concerns me the most is that in the future, in any kind of geopolitical and strategic scenario, we're going to see a much decrease, if you will, and decreased space for a local and print media, which is arguably one of the most important vectors to or places rather to fight disinformation and misinformation. And why? Because you have some very talented investigative journalists all over the world, and even in small markets, even in the United States. And I can give you, if you're interested later, one specific example where they do investigative journalism that can lead to real specific real implications, can stop real world harm. And I think this is really, really important. And we've even seen it recently, a situation, just one quick example on that, where in Ghana, a CNN journalist uncovered an IRA information research agency network in Ghana, and was able to coordinate and cooperate with both Facebook and Twitter to take down those accounts. So we see that now, and I think this is why it's going to be so important for the future. But my concern is we're going to be actually getting to a place where we're going to see a much shrinking environment for local press. And then the final thing I'm going to just talk about, and then just one more comment at the end, is that technological competition for influence. look, we're talking about disinformation, we're talking about artificial intelligence, machine learning, natural language processing, robotics. I mean, and 5G, what that would look like in the future, all these technologies. All I'll say there is when we're thinking about the future, this technology can be used for good or for bad. We are already seeing how, for example, Russia and China are using these technologies in a negative way to achieve their desired, effects, if you will, or objectives. It's everything from, we just talk obviously a lot about disinformation, but think about the censorship as well. That's another issue here as well. So again, using them in a negative way, and also think about what the name right now escapes me, but there was a company in Silicon Valley that basically helped Belarus shut down internet as part of the ongoing protests in Minsk. But again, technology can be harnessed in both ways. I see a lot of hope now that I'm also on the tech side, where there's a lot of innovating technology that's being developed, what I say harnessed for good, if you will, to both fight disinformation, address some of the deep fakes, if you will, or augmented virtual reality, augmented reality. But and then also have broader impact, global impact in a positive way. So there is a lot of that happening, and I am hopeful that the future will see a lot more of that in the next 10 to 20 years. But going back to my earlier point that I made on vaccines, when it comes to also technology and technological innovations, is that people are in it for themselves, particularly when you're dealing with a potential competition. So we cannot underestimate that. So I'm going to end with this comment, if you will. And the comment is this. When we think about the future, and we think about whether it's 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now, we have to look at the past in order to not just think about the future, but help us develop the appropriate strategic and operational plans to plan for that future. In doing so, I think on one hand, it's important to think about, in some ways, about the adversary and how the adversary thinks here. In another way, and when I say that, I'm thinking of, when you think about disinformation campaigns, so we need to, in the US government, in DoD, almost think like marketers. How might we design counter whole of government, whole of society, counter disinformation and malign influence campaigns? There has to be a lot of coordination. There has to be synchronization. Has to be more and more. There's a lot of talk about it now, but I think there needs to be up-leveled. This piece of it is coordination both with tech, with industry, and cannot forget about civil society institutions that are working with the population as well. But particularly also when you thinking about the adversary, it's thinking about, ultimately, it is a competition for the audience, right? How are both we are trying to strengthen the conditions in the environment and conditions for the populations and the audience, and how is the adversary trying to attack those conditions or the vulnerabilities in the environment and audience? So in future, it's really important to think about who are the targeted audience, what is the theory of change you're actually seeking to have, and most importantly, when designing counter disinformation, malign influence campaigns, what are the very specific changes in behavior you are seeking to see in that targeted population and audience for the future? And then have that, from the most tactical level to the most strategic level, have that tie to the broader operational, strategic, and national security strategy, if you will. So I'll leave it at that. I talked a lot, I know. And look forward to the Q&A at the end.
All right, thank you. So Shannon, you're next.
Okay, we're just projecting Shannon's presentation. Just give us a thumbs up when you're able to see that, Nicole. Okay. You just advanced the slide.
Good morning, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity. It's been a pleasure to be invited, and I'm very grateful. You know, it's funny, Warren Buffett has a great quote. He said, when the tide goes out, you can see who's been skinny dipping. And I like to keep that quote in mind when I look at the title of this presentation, Good News About COVID-19. People look at the title and they think, what on earth could be the good news? And the good news is, I think COVID-19 has allowed us a very dramatic reveal when it comes to China. The other thing I'll just say before I begin is I've been watching China since 1990, and I slowly developed a very strong opinion. We've been asking some of the wrong questions about China. You know, historically, we've said, is China our enemy? And my own thinking over the time has developed that the better question to ask is, does the Chinese Communist Party think the United States is the enemy of China? And so I'd ask all of you to bear that in mind as we're talking and moving forward. Today, I seek to demonstrate, encourage, and offer a criteria against which we can measure success. I hope to demonstrate that we are all China experts now. So our access to information and technology means any one of you listening could drill down deep in an area of China that I know nothing about, and you could stump me. I'm sure you could. So I think we're all China experts now, and I think we need to leverage that wonderful capability we have as Westerners. But I would also say that I seek to demonstrate that strategic foresight and futurist disciplines leverage those strengths. I hope to encourage by simplifying without reductionism. I think that's a danger when we watch China. It's such a complicated subject that we have to simplify to discuss it, but we don't want to reduce either its importance or its complexity to a point where we miss the most important points. I'd like to encourage optimism. I think that there's a way for us to contend with the Chinese Communist Party so the whole world wins. Indeed, I would say if we don't contend with the Chinese Communist Party in the proper way, the whole world will lose. I would say the good news about COVID-19 and the Belt and Road Initiative is quite profound. Proof of success today will be, we'll get some challenging questions and some good discussion. I like to ask people a very simple, straightforward question. What do you think of China? The best answer I've been given to that very simple question was, I wouldn't want to live in a world where China called the shots. And so I would ask all of you to ask yourself that question. Would you like to live in a world, and do you think that the United States would be able to perform at its highest capacity in a world where China calls the shots? I'd also like to close this slide with a quote by Thomas Jefferson that illustrates our commitment in the United States to following objective truth. I think that will inoculate us against our own ideological blindness, by the way. I should let you know that I do have a Cold Warrior perspective. I'll tell a very quick story. When I was a young officer in Germany, East Germany was still a reality, and I served on the border. And I can remember as a young, very, very sort of optimistic, idealistic young officer, driving in my Jeep with my driver on a cool fall day and going up a hill that overlooked East Germany. And as we drove up to the top of the hill, I saw at turns in the road beautiful crosses. There was a total of 7. And I can remember thinking, oh, how lovely, somebody has put crosses on the road. Isn't that pretty? And of course, when I got to the top, I looked down from the hill to the border between East Germany and West Germany. And that was where, of course, the East German Volkspolizei had shot and killed a family, a mother and father and their 5 children. And they had allowed them to starve and die and bleed to death without medical aid from the West Germans. And I thought to myself, this is what an ideology can do, right? So that's part of my frame of reference. So as we look at Xi Jinping and we ask ourselves, as we study him and we study the Chinese Communist Party, what does he seek to overthrow and why? I think it's a good question to ask. Based on the actions of the Chinese Communist Party, what Xi Jinping seeks to do is overthrow the post-World War II global framework. And that is our creation. So any of the global framework entities, WTO, the United Nations, the World Bank, World Health Organization, NATO, we could pick many, some of which have fallen by the wayside and have been updated, but essentially it's a framework that we have built. I would also ask you to ask yourself this question. It's a wonderful thing, and I Googled it moments ago. What percentage of global financial transactions take place in the US dollar? The answer is 88%. That's an important proof of success. And the other thing I would ask you to remember is here's a quote from one of our previous talks that we heard an American ask on the call, and they said it rather dismissively. They said space has become a vanity project for the super wealthy. And they said that in a way that was, and I think good-naturedly critical of the US government. But my response when I heard them say that was, it is because we have individuals who can leverage our system and create the kind of wealth that allows the United States to put rockets into space from the private sector. And Jeff Bezos may become the world's first trillionaire. I would also ask this question: how many of us know how many years 1 trillion seconds is? If you look that up, you'll be surprised. So 1 trillion seconds is how many years? So let's talk very briefly about US values and ask ourselves whether we want US values to prevail in the coming future or we want China's values to prevail. Sanctity of the individual, privacy, the rule of law, capitalism, and objective truth, a commitment to objective truth. I just nominate these. You may disagree, and I encourage pushback. What are PRC values based on their behavior and demonstrated actions? Primacy of the collective, primacy certainly of the Chinese Communist Party, socialism, and relative truth. What does the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party have a genius for? I would tell you an embrace of ideology that strengthens their cultural homogeneity. They have a genius for leveraging technology for political ends. I've been in a lot of war games in the last few weeks, and it's fascinating to me how often China's social credit score comes up in discussion. The Chinese consider deception and ambiguity virtues, and I don't think that's an overgenerous generalization. I would also tell you I do make a distinction in my own mind that China is a culture, not a country, and that we have already allowed the Chinese Communist Party to position themselves in the world as the leader of the culture, not just the country. We're going to pay a high price for that, by the way. So China is a culture, not a country, and the PRC is a country. The ROC is a country. But the Chinese Communist Party sees itself as the leader of the civilization that is China. What does the US have a genius for? Forgiveness, reconciliation, and clarity. We have a genius for harnessing the private sector. In fact, I would tell you that the private individual leveraging technology in the 21st century is the United States' secret weapon that will ensure, if we're not careless, it will ensure we prevail so the whole world wins. And we also have a genius for freedom. I'll tell a very quick story about an experience I had while I was at the embassy in Beijing. A very kind representative of the US Embassy in Beijing saw that the People's Armed Police were cold in the wintertime in Beijing. And so this very kind individual gave to the People's Armed Police, who are responsible for the perimeter security of our embassy there, a warming shack. While I was there at the embassy, a Uyghur sought political asylum. He very heroically hurled himself over the wall of our embassy, threw himself into the arms of an off-duty Marine. The Marine quickly kind of wrapped him up, found out that he was armed with a sword. So he had embarrassed the People's Armed Police, had vaulted over the wall, found himself in the arms of a US Marine who was there, of course, as part of the security detachment. He was remanded to the regional security officer, who at that time was a young regional security officer. She followed the rules in the book and she handed this man back over to the People's Armed Police. That evening, as I left the embassy compound, I stood and listened to the People's Armed Police torturing that man. They'd been torturing him all afternoon in the shack we gave them. And the NCO, who was in charge of the torture session, looked at me with such malevolence as I was leaving, because of course I knew what they were doing and we could hear this man screaming. And that NCO, who's the equivalent of a US Army Sergeant First Class, pay grade E7, he knew there was nothing I could do about it. And it didn't matter to them that he had that authority to torture that man. And we had remanded him back to that authority. So I just offer you that as a story of Chinese values. Another good thing to remember is that a good friend of mine said to me once, he's a profound Chinese teacher, no Chinese person who leaves a Chinese language movie believes he has understood 100% of every word. We can discuss that, but I don't want to go over on my time. So I was very grateful for the opportunity to work on the Global Futures Report, and I'll review the content on the Belt and Road Initiative here very briefly. As Lieutenant Colonel Sotiriadis laid out, we envision, for the purposes of discussion, 4 potential futures: continuation, discipline, systemic collapse, and transformation. Continuation, in that scenario, I saw the PRC playing not to lose. And in that situation, they mismanaged the downside of the infrastructure project and lose control. By playing to win, on the other hand, the Chinese Communist Party overplays and accelerates BRI. This sets in turbulence. And it's interesting to me that in Pakistan recently, there were some unforeseen consequences where now within Pakistan, there is political turbulence over who's going to control the Belt and Road Initiative in Pakistan. But in potential future B, we sort of looked into that possibility. Potential future C is a systemic collapse. That's one that everybody likes to talk about because it can be more exciting. And in that situation, we saw transparency in a post-COVID world overwhelming the Chinese Communist Party. And that kind of transparency, which I think the Chinese Communist Party is not prepared for, it's internet transparency, it's technology transparency, puts the Chinese Communist Party in a bind, and it leads to instability that spreads for the Chinese Communist Party. And the potential future D is a transformation. This is the one that I think is actually quite possible. It drives the Chinese Communist Party to co-opetition, not a typo. So cooperative competition with the United States. And it requires that we drag the Chinese Communist Party into, I would say, a future of more clarity and better, fairer competition. I like that future, and I like talking about it. But on the other hand, I'm very grateful to this way of thinking, which I've learned from Jason Schenker and Lieutenant Colonel Sotiriadis, because it allowed me to see another experimental future too. And that is one in which I suggest that the Chinese Communist Party cannot accept the existence of the Republic of China. I say this for many reasons, but essentially it boils down to ideology and a question of ideology. Do we believe the Chinese Communist Party believes their own ideology? I would submit to you that the vast majority of Chinese communists do believe their ideology, unlike the Soviet Union, who had bolted their ideology on and became, I would suggest, skeptical of their own ideology until they didn't believe it. I believe the Chinese communists, for the most part, except for people at the very, very top, believe their ideology. With them, it's, to use an overused metaphor, it's baked in, not bolted on. So if that's the case, and I think it is, what does the Republic of China represent to the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party? And if we have time, I'd be happy to tell a story about those two representations of a name that I was given. There are full-form characters on the left and short-form characters on the right. That's not insignificant. That distinction is not insignificant. It represents cultural distinctions that are vital to understanding the difference between the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China. So here are some questions I'd like to leave you with regard to this experimental future. Why can the PRC not accept the existence of the ROC? And what is the Chinese Communist Party's claim to power? So I have some concluding thoughts I'd like to leave you with and some questions. The strengths of strategic forecasting are that they allow us to see things we would not otherwise see, and they allow us to experiment with ideas we would not otherwise stumble upon. In fact, listening to Jake this morning, I was taking notes and I was thinking of the many lessons I've learned in the war games I've been invited to participate in the last month. And even now, strategic foresighting is allowing me to see things I never would have seen otherwise. Well, what does Hong Kong tell us about Taiwan? Does the Chinese Communist Party make decisions that are good for it? That's a good question I think we need to think about. And so the artificial intelligence and augmented reality that the Chinese are developing, and they're developing them at a furious pace. A good friend of mine who works for MITRE is doing some groundbreaking work on this. So AI and AR will reflect the values of their progenitors. If we beat the Chinese Communist Party to the punch in deploying ethical AI that conforms with our values and ethical AR that conforms with our values, we will not be living in a world where China calls the shots. Do we want them to call the shots, or do we want to call the shots? So who in the world wins depends on whose values prevail. And I'll just offer you, just please don't forget this, that the Great Leap Forward, and these are relatively conservative figures, okay? The Great Leap Forward resulted in 18 to 45 million deaths in China. The Cultural Revolution, hundreds of thousands to 20 million deaths. Now, look, I think it's remarkable that there's that broad a spread, right? And then I'll also tell you there is no such thing as a private individual or a private company in the PRC. And the next time you hear somebody refer to a private individual or a private company in the People's Republic of China, ask them to define what they mean. I've heard some surprising definitions of private. Thank you very much. I look forward to a conversation, and I'm very grateful to be part of this discussion. I'm very grateful to Lieutenant Colonel Sotiriadis and for all of you who are participating in this conversation. Pending your questions, that concludes my brief.
All right. Well, thank you all. So now we will move on to the Q&A portion of the team session. We also have about 15 minutes over the hour to go over with Q&A, so we will be going on a bit past the hour to address some of these questions. So our first question is from our UK colleague Fergus at DSTL, and the question is, what role can historical analysis play in complementing / enhancing your analytical framework?
So yeah, I'll take that one, Nicole, and I would say that that's a great question because it really speaks to a core piece of the process of working in strategic foresight and mapping out the trajectory of disruption. And so I mentioned earlier in the presentation that historians tend to make the best futurists, right? I say that tongue in cheek, but the real narrative behind that is that you've really got to be able to understand how historical change, not only military change, but societal change, technological change, industrial change has come about, and understand sort of the dynamics behind those changes. But more importantly, then using the methodological skills of strategic foresight, be able to identify via today's weak signals and emerging trends, the touch points, similarities, and differences, which is a key point in the historical sources of change and the dynamic events that are taking place now. Because ideally, today's weak signals, if we're able to look at them correctly, they really become tomorrow's reality. So I would say that historical analysis is as much a part of the process as building out future scenarios and building a data visualization.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Mr. Todd Veazey, the director of SMA, and this question is for you, Vera. So the question is, have you encountered any disinformation inoculation strategies that might be effective in diminishing the effects of this approach? And also, is action primarily in the private sector, like social media companies, or is action primarily in the private sector, like social media companies, or is there a role for governments? Can regulatory measures be effectively adopted?
Great question. Let me take the second part of it first, and then we will talk about kind of, counter disinformation strategies, because I think it actually, they're related. I do not think, and I will emphasize, I do not think the emphasis is all and the onus should be on social media companies in the private sector. Yes, they are part of the problem and part of the solution. Yes, there is algorithmic bias and micro-targeting, and the information spread. I mean, the virality of information on platforms is something like we've never seen before, but it is not the only part of this problem and the solution. Here's why. There is a role for governments to play, and it's not just in regulation. Regulation is certainly part of it, and I think what the government can do is also in terms of if we're talking about Congress or the European Union, in instance, and thinking about Europe, it's not just regulation, but they can actually indirectly push, if you will, platforms to err on the side of transparency, err on the side of accountability before you even reach to regulation, right? But going back to Defense Department, going back to the Air Force, or going back to the broader, interagency, there are so many things that the government does and can do in both two things: in countering adversaries and also strengthen the vulnerabilities in the environment. And I'm talking about promoting independent media, creating more people-to-people programs, exchanges, education. All of those things are really, really important. We've done this so much. I mean, there's plenty of congressional testimonies out this on USAID and State Department, and the Defense Department has done so much with the whole construct of by, with, and through, which of course SOF uses, but I think it applies holistically here to actually not just counter the adversary when we're dealing with malign influence and disinformation campaigns, but also actually by, with, and through strengthen the conditions in the operating environment. And then the third piece of it is not just government and tech or government and industry. It is also civil society. I cannot even underestimate how much civil society plays such an important role. They're the ones that are actually working with the local population on the ground to actually mitigate some of these threats, to ensure that folks are getting credible information and access to resources, and strengthening the conditions in the environment. So that's another part. And then fundamentally, at the end of all of this, it comes back to you and me and every individual voter and citizen, wherever you are, whether you're in the United States or whether you're in, I don't know, in the former Soviet Union or wherever you are in any part of the world. Because it is up to us also, and this is something there's been a lot of talk about this and pushing, we talk about in media and journalism, digital literacy, right, or media literacy. That's important. I think what we really need now is literacy for everyday individuals. Look, we're in COVID right now. I'm a mom. I have 2 elementary school kids, right? And my kids are learning virtually right now. And so what about digital literacy for children and for everyday adults, so we can think about this information critically? So that's all going to be really important. And then the last thing I will say, the last thing I will say in terms of counter strategies, we need to think in many ways, we need to think like the adversaries and like the business. And I think there's a couple of things that I can get back to you in terms of creating actually full-on counter disinformation campaigns. It has to do with identifying what is the theory of change that you're seeking to achieve, how does it tie to your broader strategic objectives, and what is the change of behavior they're actually seeking.
Okay, thank you. So our next question, I believe, is targeted at Jake. And the question is, your slide on frequency of conflict intensifies by conflict item 2017. Or it's related to that. So the question is going to push back on that analysis a bit. There are some overlapping economic, political, and socio-cultural layers that also play a role in conflict that your analysis here doesn't account for. What is the underlying methodology that you used for this? And I would argue that increasingly limited access to essential resources like water, but also deforestation, soil erosion, flooding, fires, pest swarms, overfishing, etc., augmented by the effects of climate change, are actually heightening conflict. And that is the primary trend right now on a global level.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And no, I'll respectfully disagree with that premise and highlight the fact that what we're really talking about is a debate between materialist outcomes and ideational outcomes in international relations and security politics. What I'm trying to ask by projecting this idea of ideological motivations, and I think we have to fundamentally redefine ideology really to get at the crux of what I'm talking about, not just as a system of beliefs, but we need to go a step further in our theoretical discourse and really think about ideology as the way in which ideas become material, and then how those material structures that are formed become important in a systemically important way for interpreting security politics. And those are 2 fundamentally different propositions. So when you talk about things like resource competition, when you talk about things like energy resources, fishing disputes and things like that, those are certainly part of that, but those are actually accelerants or decelerants of a particular ideological model. When we talk about great power competition, we tend to just paint Russia and China, for example, with a broad authoritarian brush, and just assume that the primary goal is an accumulation of power, and that there really isn't any sort of motivation behind that other than sort of this realist outcome that all states are the same and they seek to increase their material power, and that material power creates the security dilemma. Right, this tried and true realist argument. The problem is that argument doesn't give us insight into when we actually are looking at fundamental shifts in the established international order. It doesn't really tell us when a hegemonic shift is going to happen. It just tells us that inevitably something will happen as revisionist powers seek to overthrow others, right? But it really doesn't give us warning signs or give us any true insight into how that process takes place. And so what I actually propose, and this is part of a book that actually I'm working on right now that'll come out next summer, really is a fundamental transformation of what ideology does to security politics, I think, in a way that we haven't looked at it or examined it, and instead looking at ideology as a living, breathing system, a complex adaptive system, where you actually have elements of society, general population, the socio-political elites, and then state-centric control apparatuses coming together and actually having this living, breathing network eclipse the control of the state and actually have a direct impact on foreign policies. I mean, how else can we explain why, if according to realist theory, for example, countries would make detrimental decisions that actually go against their rational self-interest? And what I would submit here is that rational self-interest is actually a very historical and contextual formation. And so if we're just looking at things like material power competition, that really isn't going to get to the complicated dynamics that are at play that is actually driving the great power competition of today. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Our next question is from Brian Week from First IO Command. And the question is, in terms of center of gravity analysis, what are some PRC weaknesses and vulnerabilities at the operational and strategic level?
That's a great question. I hope my answer is sufficient. In any event, I hope it'll start a good conversation. I would say, sort of pursuant to the point Jake just made, anytime we can target where it's clear that the Chinese Communist Party is doing something that is not in its own best interests, right? So in answer to the question, and say the question again, please, I want to make sure I get it right.
Oh, yeah, sure thing. The question is, in terms of center of gravity analysis, what are some of the PRC weaknesses and vulnerabilities at the operational and strategic level?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say population stability. Short answer is population stability. Here's what we know through demographic analysis of China. It is impossible for them to get where they say they want to go. They are running out of water. They have economic pressures on their population which are impossible to mitigate. So from an educational perspective, I'll just take the first one first. In order for China to get where they say, where the Chinese Communist Party, in order for the People's Republic of China to get where the Chinese Communist Party says they want to be by 2049, they had better radically change their educational system so they can think like we think. I go back to the fact that we have ruled, we the United States, we the West, have ruled the world economically since the close of World War II. To do that requires a certain way of thinking. It requires being versatile. It requires all kinds of things the Chinese Communist Party cannot allow to happen in China. So if we want to attack them, that's a big if, and if we want to destabilize their society and find their center of gravity, we should focus on those parts of their country which are most vulnerable. Their education system, their population, satisfaction with their current situation, and the economic stresses that are currently pulling at their entire system. Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party have been tightening down the controls for about the last 10 years because they know this time is coming, this reckoning. So that's my answer, is their center of gravity is stability within their population based on the stressors that are tearing them apart. And I would recommend a book called Stumbling Giant. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Our next question is, describing the possible futures is interesting and creative, but it is crucial to track of the events that indicate which possible future, or a combination, or one not in your taxonomy, is moving towards becoming reality. What data are being tracked and what decisions will be made to prepare for the actual outcomes?
Yeah, great question. And so, I mean, I would point us to the current situation that we are living through right now, right? The reality of the situation is that I think the value proposition with future studies is that, you know, if we built a scenario that was the likely course of action, we really wouldn't be doing due diligence as futurists. So I understand there's this debate of sort of where's the value proposition in building a future scenario that actually becomes practical and usable, right, for strategic planning that I can implement tomorrow. And you know what I would say and how I communicate this regularly when I speak with our senior leaders is that what we really need to do is, I think this serves the purpose of checking our current assumptions And so the intelligence community processes are already ongoing and are, continuing data analysis and sort of geopolitical trends. The current projections are happening, and those are positive developments. And all of that data is useful, and then will get put into any sorts of futures scenario type development. But where I think we're able to make a leap, an intellectual leap here by implementing strategic foresight, is then asking those tough questions about where do we want to go as an organization, and then identifying the sources of disruption that would potentially hinder us from getting there. And so when we talk about building a scenario that is the most likely course of action, if we're saying that, we're actually, I would argue, maybe even ignoring a whole host of issues that may not seem like they're actually even related to the core issue we're discussing, but they have touch points, as we've seen here in this current disruption, that will come back and directly affect that core mission set. And so we've really got to embrace this analytic eclecticism and how we build our analysis in a fundamentally different way. And that really means understanding that everything is interrelated. And so, there's a useful combo of the quantitative data sets and then visualizing those tools together, weaponizing that data, I think, in a way that is able to really build a comprehensive picture of the strategic environment. But then we need to stretch the limits of that quantitative analysis and lean on the strategic foresight tools that could say, we have archetypical scenarios that we know have recurred throughout history, and let's walk through these 4 frameworks to understand who the winners and losers are in each case, and then determine what we would need to do in order to make sure that our side comes out as a winner. And that's what I think our core task really is to do. Shannon's going to add one thing.
I also want to say I've been exhibiting titanic self-control because I get so excited with these questions. Jake spoke about weak signals, right? In the 1990s, just as a retrospective, in the 1990s, the Chinese Communist Party mandated that China update its communication system, right? So that was when they really started embracing fiber optic. So looking back, if we had been tracking that, what we realized was we were hearing less and less. So it was a fading weak signal, right? Why were we hearing less and less? Because they were getting more sophisticated. So if we project into the future, we happen to know that the PLA is conducting fewer and fewer war games, tactical and strategic exercises that we can watch. Why? It's a fading weak signal. They're getting rarer and rarer because they're going digital. So this is an example of using a strategic forecasting methodology, weak signals, and identifying what's a fading weak signal, turning up the volume on that and tracking it as it fades and attaching significance to it. So in this situation, I would tell you that I find very troubling that there is a fading weak signal being transmitted by the PLA, and that's the sort of thing that I think we can use to predict the future. That's useful.
Okay, thank you. And this may be the last question that we have a chance to address today, but it's from Gerald Nordley. And the question is, do stresses such as COVID-19 act as amplifiers of ideological differences?
Absolutely, they do. I would say that not only ideological differences, but they act as accelerators of trends and dynamics, situational dynamics that were already there. I mean, before the pandemic hit, I think probably most of us here on this session would admit that we were already in this unprecedented environment of complex technological change, this great power competition environment where adversaries have studied our playbook and seek to negate our strategic advantages. But when we talk about something like COVID-19, in terms of the direct question about ideological acceleration, it absolutely does, because what it does is it actually imposes internal pressures on governments and populations. And so what it does is it actually sees populations, governments, individuals look for new sources of meaning. And so you have this process of ideological acceleration that's accompanied by these triggers, such as the pandemic or other issues of that magnitude. And so that's part and parcel of, I think, of a better way of asking a question, or perhaps even modeling out how ideological power networks themselves can actually increase or decrease in intensity, and then how the effects of that actually manifest themselves in the form of foreign policy or security policy. But thanks for that question. A lot to unpack there.
Okay, well, we do have 2 extra minutes, so we will address one more question then. And it's one more question from our UK colleague, Fergus at DSTL. And the question is it possible to conduct any kind of sensitivity analysis to understand if system entities or courses of action have a disproportionate effect within each future?
Nicole, we had a little delay on that last question. Would you be so kind as to just read it one more time?
Yes, sure. Is it possible to conduct any kind of sensitivity analysis to understand if any system entities or courses of action have a disproportionate effect within each future?
Well, I think that what the question really is getting at is this idea of, how are you essentially going back and almost backcasting some of the key variables that would play a decisive role in getting to a particular outcome with respect to the scenarios. And so the answer would be yes. I mean, there definitely is a way to do that. And part of that has to do with the methodological approach that we'll take. We highlighted today the 4 futures framework, which is a very, very, I think, common way to approach futures. But I would add that future studies it consists of a lot more than just the 4 futures frameworks. And so, there's a host of methodological tools that futurists are able to use and employ to sort of get at these outcomes. We obviously don't have time to go into all of those here in this discussion. But one way I think to sort of get at the question and the premise of how to identify, those key variables is this idea of, a systems-based approach to a particular issue. And so if you look at our global scenarios, for example, there isn't any one determining factor that actually, makes the scenarios look a certain way. What we did is actually try to map out from the mass disruptive event of the pandemic, interspersed with the weak signals and emerging trends that were already emanating from the subject areas that we picked. How do those fit together, and which direction do we go from here from the present disruption? I'd argue that what we could do is sort of control for a different variable, and if we would have gone instead of the pandemic, but had taken maybe economic collapse as sort of the primary source of disruption, or a different sort of action that would have provoked the same magnitude of seismic change, we could have come up with different outcomes as well. But you would have also seen some similarities because the weak signals and emerging trends across that range of disruption that we developed would have remained the same, right? Those issues are already out in the environment. So I think definitely there's value added in being able to also backcast sort of through the sources of disruption and then develop the critical area of study. But I think that's also why we want to have this idea of codependent variables where there isn't any one singular event that is deterministic in terms of the overall outcome, right? It's this ecology of factors that we want to embrace and understand.
Okay. Well, that is all the time that we have for today's panel discussion, but I'd like to thank everyone again for tuning into this team session and also thank today's speakers, Ms. Vera Zakem, Mr. Shannon McGurk, and Lieutenant Colonel Jake Sotiriadis for taking the time to present. So have a good one, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to J39 and the UK Ministry of Defence for inviting us. This was really a pleasure for us. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right, thank you.